All right, so here we are. It's another episode of Film Streak. This episode, I just want to talk about two movies because I actually was having this conversation the other day, and it's something that I've come back to over and over throughout the years, throughout doing this podcast even. The idea of remakes. Telling a story on film and then retelling it. And I know it's not something that's just a thing that happens in films. I know it happens in TV shows. I know it happens even in literature. I think it's just an interesting phenomena, I guess, with film is that you use the same medium to say the same thing, maybe put a new spin on it, maybe add more to it. And I think over the years, we've seen it kind of evolve, especially like legacy sequels, right? Where we're kind of telling the same thing, doing the same thing, but with new characters, whether that's something like Star Wars with The Force Awakens, where it's kind of basically taking parts from the original film or films, or you've got something like Top Gun Maverick, which is really following the same model as the original film, but it's a sequel. We're not replacing Maverick. We're not retelling the story of Goose and all that, but we kind of are, right? So it's a strange like hybrid of a sequel and a remake at the same time. And so remakes in general, they always kind of fascinate me just because I'm interested why. Like, what is the thinking there? And sometimes I can see it where it's like maybe a film wasn't done in the best way, maybe the technology or the techniques of that time. Maybe things have changed, things have gotten better, so why not take another stab at it? Or maybe for a new audience, right? And I've talked about this in previous episodes, of course. I've done, what did we do? We did Solaris, we did Suspiria, we did something else. But even years ago, I used to have this website and we did a podcast for that called Soda Pop Journal. And that's when I was doing some writing and wrote some pieces on, let's see, there was the Thomas Crown Affair, the remake and the original. There was The Getaway. And I feel like there was another one in there somewhere. But it's something that I'm always interested to know both the differences, but also the reasons why. And, it's funny. I don't remember if I've talked about it in this before, but when I did that episode or when I did that piece on The Getaway, the original stars Steve McQueen and Al McGraw, and it's directed by Sam Peckinpah. And then it was remade in, I think it was like 93 or 94, maybe, with Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger, and I think it was directed by Roger Donaldson. And, it was an interesting update to the same story. It wasn't exactly the same. It wasn't set in the same time period. It was kind of moved up to today's times or the 90s. And yet there was a different dynamic between the characters, the couple in that film. And so, look, I posted some clips of the film to YouTube way back when. I mean, it's probably 15 years ago now. And it's funny, like, I still have that account and I can still see like the clip of Steve McQueen pulling the car over and he starts, kind of beating on Ally McGraw. And I say beating, but he kind of smacks her around and gets rough with her. And it's not pleasant, but it's funny that there seems to be a lot of like Joe Rogan listeners that pull up that clip. And I have a feeling it's because he probably mentions it on the podcast. I don't listen to it. But that's what I gather. And I guess he's saying that he really beat her up and all that. Because that's the context. If I'm just reading the comments that people leave, it seems like every, 6 months or so, it comes up on his show and maybe they pull up the clip and people go watch it. And it's just curious, like that is the one clip that always seems to get people's attention. And yet, I posted the clip, the same scene from the remake, which honestly, I think even if I had to revisit that now, I still feel like the remake is just edging out the original. And part of it is because of that scene and the way that scene plays out in the two different movies. And that could be something that is just changed with time, changed with, the way our society is in more current, sensibilities towards relationships and, the equality between men and women, or the differences between men and women. But that scene plays out in a maybe more realistic way today. Maybe in the 60s or 70s, the way was, I'm just going to pull the car over and I'm going to smack the hell out of you. That just doesn't fly anymore today. And it didn't even fly in the 90s. So anyway, all that to say, like, the idea of remakes and why people decide to remake a film or retell a story, that's always just a curiosity to me. But I also like to kind of break it down and understand, one, how and why. And does it make it any more relevant of a story? And that's where I just recently landed on these films that I want to talk about. And the reason I want to talk about Red Dawn from 1984 and the remake from 2012 is because it's a film it's a story that I remember being very intrigued by when I saw the original film. And as a kid, I saw the original film on, I guess, cable or maybe like, VHS or whatever, right? You would have watched it on home video. And I just remember it being a thing where it's like, is this possible? Like, could the Russians really invade the United States? And I'll be honest, like, I really forgot that there was a whole other element to how that worked in the film. Like, it wasn't just, Soviet soldiers just showed up on our doorstep. It also involved like other countries, and I guess with like Cuban and just Latin American, presence. And yet at the same time, it's like, looking at it now, like, it's a weird place that film sits for me, because I have a memory of it being sort of a real possibility and like a threat, like the idea of it. And yet when you look at like logistically, like, could this even make sense? I don't even see how this could actually really work. And so going back to watch the original film, I did go back and see it and really pay attention and follow through in its entirety. Because when I would have seen the original film the first time, I might have been like, 10, 12 years old. I was not at an age to really understand what the hell was going on, So to look at it now with adult eyes and understanding more about the world and even the world of the time, I still have the question of like, I don't think this really could have worked this way, right? Like, this is kind of just basically fantasy. And so that's where I come down on like, well, maybe this is a film or a story that could be remade and told a little more, accurately or authentically in a way. And, the other thing is, like, as a film made in 1984, this wasn't really a blockbuster. It wasn't a tentpole type film. It wasn't really a thing quite yet. So it really comes off as like a very small, scrappy, kind of low budget film. Like, it doesn't feel like it's got a lot of money, a lot of steam behind it. And even the cast of it, who pretty much everybody in that cast went on to do other work and become stars or celebrities, at least in their own right. At the time, like, this was still, a lot of these people were still unknowns. And so that's a curious place to find that film of like, I could see where it just leaves a lot to be desired, and that's where I feel like if I would have maybe had a better sense of it and like what kind of a film it was at the time, maybe I would have more of a nostalgic attachment to it. I don't know. I feel like that's probably where a lot of people find this film. It kind of like, for me, it was kind of like Goonies, right? Where I never saw that as a kid. I know a bunch of other people my age did see it and they loved it and they really got attached to it. And I didn't see it until I was well into my adult life. And I got the idea of it and I thought, okay, there's something interesting here. But I didn't have any kind of fondness for it, you know? And so this one, I could see it. Maybe, the Wolverines, like we're scrappy. We're going to take the fight to the bad guys. We're going to reclaim our home and, fight for our country and all that. I get all that. And that makes for an interesting premise. But the way that the original film kind of plays out, I think a remake might have been warranted, And so it's not to say the original film is bad necessarily, but it's not great. I just got to put it that way. I didn't come away really like, oh man, I really missed out on this one. It's real middle of the road. And honestly, there are even parts of it that are kind of lacking, So we get to the remake here. We get to this remake in 2012. And here's a film that technically, and I think logically, is much better, right? It looks more polished. It looks more thought out, even in terms of how we get to know these characters and just the way some of this plays out, like in terms of who the villain is and how these kids basically go about taking back their home. That's the one thing that struck me. And I didn't have a memory of this, of the original film, is like the very first scene in the 1984 version, we go right into it. It's like they're in a classroom. I don't remember. It's like a history lesson or something. And then you look out the window and there's like soldiers landing outside the school. They're like, dropping in with parachutes. And I'm like, oh, okay, we wasted no time. We just got right to the invasion. In the remake, the 2012 version, it at least takes some time to set up like who these characters are, who are the people that we're going to be following in this story, and what their roles might be and how they relate to each other, at least. We got the two brothers, we got the friends, we got the dad. We get a little more context. And I think that's maybe more, that's a more well-rounded way to develop a story, right? Is like, don't just throw me right into it unless you just don't really need me to care about these characters. Give me a little more. Give me something to hang on to, Give them a little more. These are actors, like give them something to work with. And so by that account, the remake does a better job of that. And even the action, even the pacing of it, the production of it, it seems to be working on a much higher level, The standard of quality is way up there now. And, I got to say, for all of the pluses that it has as being more modern, more contemporary, more polished, it doesn't quite have the magic. These characters, again, I don't even know if it's the actors in it, but these characters, this group of kids, like I don't feel that much more interested in whether they succeed or not. It's not that I don't want them to succeed. Of course, these characters, this is a purely American film, a story that we're telling here. It's like no one's ever brought the fight to our doorstep. And if that were to happen, how would we react? And especially, how would the youth who could or could not be kind of disenfranchised or discouraged or just defeated, like how would they react? And so I think this is a very interesting premise, just in general, right? Just the idea of not even like a communist country or whatever, but like what happens if the future of our society depends on teenagers and whether they can step up and get into the fight. And I'm sure that's a big part of the original premise. The original story is written by John Milius, directed by John Milius. And, I think if we're talking about something that is like an after effect or a residual sort of lasting effects of going to, let's say, Vietnam or just going to war for your country, And then you combine that with, of course, like the Cold War, which was still a thing at the time, where you have this kind of phantom enemy, that we are trained, we are geared for war, but we have no real enemy and no real war to fight. Like, where does that energy go? Where does that all kind of, I feel like that's what the film is trying to say. The thing with the remake is like the world is in a different place. In 2012, we've seen people bring it to our doorstep. America has taken some big L's. And so that's where I think it's a different sensibility now. Like, we feel differently about how we would react to something like that because we have had to react to something like that. Whether it's 9/11 or whether it's, attacks around the world on American diplomats or even just American citizens around the world. It's like, we've seen it now. People have brought the fight to us. And it's not an entire country that does it. It is a, terrorist group. It is individuals. It just happens. And it's happened in such a different way than we ever would have expected. And so I think the way that this story applies now, it doesn't really hold up. It really does feel like it's a thing of the past. And it's not to say it couldn't be a thing of the future, I guess, but the remake, I feel like it does some good things. It tries to really take things up a level or a couple of levels. But I think it's a fundamentally, I don't want to say flawed, but it's a premise that doesn't really play anymore. It's kind of become sort of irrelevant, And, the other thing that's interesting is that the original film, it feels, even though it takes place out in the mountains, it takes place really like in a part of the country that we really don't see much. I still feel like it feels small. It feels almost claustrophobic in a way. We don't really get a sense of how this invasion, how all of these events are affecting the rest of the country. We get a little bit here and there from the pilot and as they're figuring out who the bad guys are and how to take them out and all that. But it's not really as developed as we get to see in the remake. I mean, that's one thing they do try to do is they try to expand the canvas a little bit, give us a better sense of like, how did this happen here without happening in other parts of the country? Oh, it didn't. It is happening in other parts of the country. And like, this is how it's showing itself. And so I thought, well, that was useful because the idea that another country would just invade some small part of, a state like Colorado or whatever, like, is that really how that would go? Like, where's the strategy in that? I'm not sure that really plays out the way they think. And so here in the remake, I think there's a little more meat to it. It feels like it's a little more thought out. But the idea of that kind of threat, it doesn't seem so mysterious anymore because the world we live in, we're all connected. We all kind of know news travels so fast. There's no kind of surprise attack that's ever going to happen. Unless it is something like a 9/11 where it's very unconventional, right? So some kids in a small town in the middle, out in the Rockies somewhere, like their whole community is just going to be taken by surprise. That feels so not possible anymore, I think. It's a stretch. The remake tries to address some of that, but I think it's still operating on the same kind of flawed foundation. And, I think it was an interesting attempt to remake that. I don't know if it's entirely successful, only because of the premise. We could talk about some of the cast and, of course, their relevance and what they've gone on to do in either film. You had Patrick Swayze, C. Thomas Howell, Leah Thompson. People that throughout the 80s we saw more and more of. And it made sense of like, oh yeah, these people are really, they're good performers, and they've got maybe a charisma or an energy to them. And even in the remake, you've got Chris Hemsworth before Thor and before, all of the other big stuff that he's done since then. But the rest of the cast, I feel like not really a lot of follow through, I mean, you've got a few people in there that I think also, they were of that time. They were doing things. You have, whether it's Josh Peck or Adrian Palicki from Friday Night Lights. I feel like this was really in a very similar lane, the character, but, of course, taking it to a different level. But Josh Hutcherson before or right around the time of the Hunger Games, and even him is like, I feel like, let's see some more, man. I mean, all these people in this film, I feel like they have a lot of potential, and I don't know that we've really seen a lot since then. Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who I guess plays the character from the original that was played by Powers Booth, very similar energy. And I just never connected those two. Like there is a very similar kind of vibe that they bring, I think. And so I don't know. I think by switching the, let's say the antagonist or the invading army from the Soviets and the Cubans to the North Koreans, I think that is an interesting change, and it at least makes it feel a little more current, even though I feel like that's probably even less likely to be possible. I don't know. Just something tells me like, could North Korea do this? Like, is that how they roll? I don't know. And there's a part of this, like overall, like just in general to this premise, there is a big portion that is all about we're the USA, we're untouchable, you can't get at us, especially not deep into North America. You're not getting to us in the mountains. That's where NORAD is, right? And yet, I guess this was a way to kind of undercut that, to be like, we're not untouchable. We should never consider ourselves safe. Okay, that's fair. But like reality is still reality, like it's kind of implausible. So, does that make this a bad film? I don't know. I mean, if you just take it as an action film, fine. Okay, cool. If you're really looking at what it's trying to say about like socio-political things of the time, of that era, I don't know. Maybe it's a little shaky. But either way, I mean, this was an interesting remake because I feel like, well, we remade one not that great film with another maybe just a little bit better film, but still not that great. It is an example of someone maybe saying like, well, that film had a premise that could do something that has potential, but the execution wasn't great. So let's try it again and let's just do it better. And if you just take it just at that, I guess we got there. But like I said, it just doesn't have, there's no like magnetism to it, like the cast or just the era. Like, I feel like there's no mystery. So, I don't know. That's my take on it. That's Red Dawn from 1984 and the remake from 2012. So look, if you want to hear some other episodes, maybe the others that I talked about remakes, you go to filmstreak.com. You can find other episodes there. And of course, you can subscribe in all the places for podcasts, even wherever you're listening to this. Just come back next week and we'll be here. And it's summertime. School's about to start up again. So, get your school supplies, get your book bags, and hey, if you have time, go watch something new.